The expansion of consciousness that occurs during meditation is the fundamental process of meditation. For beginners, it's very difficult to begin this process because for most beginners, which would be most people in my perception, the barrier seems to be that they believe that they are unable to see past the stream of thinking. Although it may not even be a belief, there's never been a perception beyond it, and so I suppose to call it a belief might be a little bit inaccurate. But it seems to be that for most beginners, seeing beyond the stream of thinking is the first challenge. And for some people, this can be a very persistent challenge. So the expansion of consciousness, ultimately what's occurring is that the range of our perceptions is expanded in the present moment. And what I think may be occurring is that perceptions that are normally believed to be outside of the present moment, part of what seems to be in the past and in the future, these perceptions are incorporated into the present moment as it stands. So instead of our consciousness riding along a continuum, consciousness simply is in the present moment, and it's allowed to perceive not along a continuum, but it expands and continues. And so there is no continuum. The continuum is the expansion itself. And it's very difficult to describe in words, but that does appear to be more or less what is occurring. It's difficult also to describe how one achieves this. But there needs to be a recognition that the thoughts and sense perceptions that one is having are one needs to not be drawn in. There's a certain alertness that is required to expand consciousness. So when something enters our perception, our perceptual field, which fundamentally it's not just 3 dimensions. When we're talking about the expansion of consciousness in meditation, fundamentally we're talking about the additional dimension of time. And when something enters that field, it's important not to it's important to stay alert and recognize that there is more than what is currently in the field. There's more than that. So we must stay alert and pay attention to what is emerging in the field. And it's continuously emergent. And this is why people find it so difficult. The habit is that a thought enters the mind, and there's instantly an attachment to it. And then once there's attachment to that thought, there is another stream of thinking that is spun off of it. And so for people who are very attached to their thinking and the thought process, to some extent you could argue that they don't have a lot of choice or control. And there still is, of course. The possibility of choice is always present, I would assert. And that becomes extremely apparent when the expansion has occurred, that the choice is there, the choice has always been there, but that I simply didn't choose it. So that takes us to another part of the recognition, which is that we are creating these thoughts and subsequently the environment, the conscious environment that we are immersed in internally. And when the expansion occurs, that recognition is obvious. It's clear. And this recognition, it often can occur in you could call it a state of surrender. I think this is why in Christianity the concept of surrender has been such an important concept. In fact, the crucifixion of Jesus is kind of it's a very clear physical manifestation of surrender. A man who's been taken by other humans and forced into a crucifixion, nailed to a cross, and that's at that point all Jesus could do was surrender. So there's nothing else to do but surrender. So that was just an interesting side thought. But ultimately, the expansion of consciousness, it is difficult to call it a choice, but I think on a more absolute or ultimate level, there is a choosing there. And when we're expanding our consciousness, when our reality is very much created. And so it's not just a matter of being open to what arrives, but it's also recognizing that we are creating our present moment as well. There are a lot of perspectives to be had, a lot of perspectives that precede the expansion, and they all seem to be valid. And they all seem to be valid because in the expanded state, the richness is, to the unexpanded state, literally incomprehensible. So sometimes it may seem like we're contradicting ourselves, but although I don't necessarily think any part of what I've said necessarily is self-contradicting. So fundamentally, what is required is alertness and recognition. Staying alert to what is emerging in your field of perception. The present moment is incredibly deep. Many years ago, I read Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, and that was, I responded very, very well to that book. In some ways, it introduced a new chapter into my life. Because to me, what he was saying was very clear. And ultimately, what I found out is the present moment is virtually, is infinitely deep. And there's a lot more to it than just the superficiality of, just being aware of the in-breath and out-breath and the superficial stream of thinking or the texture of your armchair. The present moment is infinitely deep, and the key is the expansion of consciousness. Ultimately, when we talk about transformative experiences, fundamentally, it seems what we are talking about is the expansion of consciousness. It's the expansion of our perception beyond its current limitations. And as a result, what is perceived as the ego basically gets transformed. Some people talk about the concept of ego death, and I have in the past, although my current impression is that isn't quite correct. The ego is always there, is always present. Fundamentally, I think, if you tried to get rid of your ego, it'd kind of be like getting rid of your shadow, as I heard one person say. And that seems to be the case. So you don't really get rid of your ego. The ego doesn't leave. It only changes clothes. And that's just part of how it works. And that's fine. That doesn't create any barriers for us. But it's important to understand that. So as the expansion of consciousness occurs, the boundaries of our awareness are pushed back, so to speak. And that's not quite right because we're talking about 4 dimensions. But as the perceptual field expands, the ego transforms as a result. Because ultimately, there is no boundary, there is no actual boundary between the ego and the expanded identity or the true self. There isn't a division. The appearance of division is basically an illusion. It's the perception is certainly real. But the division between ego and the true self is ultimately created by the current boundary of our perceptions. So logically, as we expand our consciousness, so does our perception of the ego. And so this is why when people have these extraordinary, states of meditation, they expand their consciousness. And logically, as a result, they are transformed as a result, because they're what they thought was who they are is now, it's something else entirely. And so that's why it's transformative. So there is no ego death, ultimately. It's all valid. I don't suppose anymore that there is a clear point of view. Although during the expansion of consciousness, it certainly can seem that way. But given that we are creating our experience, we have to acknowledge that a perception of clarity that is more clear over a prior perception, it's only a relative clarity, and that's fine too. But I think as we progress and continue to enrich our understanding of consciousness and the self, it's important to recognize that. But it's all valid. There is these concepts of no self and no other and no mind. I don't particularly grant them as useful, ultimately. Because I think all of these perceptions, they are valid, and that goes hand in hand with the same process that we are using to expand our consciousness. We're not excluding anything. It's all incorporated into the present moment. And that is the expansion of consciousness.